The Mechanical Museum by Thomas Ligotti. Like the rest of the world, I have spent my life searching for a way to annihilate myself. Others might prefer to characterize this more or less futile project as using such expressions as to lose oneself or to get out of oneself. I have no objection to these variant wordings and have even called on them myself to explain what I mean by the phrase annihilate myself, although these explanations are also more or less futile. To these previous explanations may be added the subjoined account, or discourse of delirium, if one prefers. It has been said that shrines and temples are best visited at night and during a time that is out of season. I followed this advice when I traveled to a degenerate resort town and along one of its back streets found the place called the Mechanical Museum. At that time, there seemed good reason to believe that this was the kind of place I was seeking, a temple in which the services of self-annihilation were offered, or at least a shrine paying homage to the creed, the wordless dream of those who would be annihilated before it is too late. This peculiar visitation, at night and out of season, appeared to my mind as a brilliant scheme, one that I had been working towards in so many ways throughout my life. And the manner in which this scheme presented itself was fatally persuasive. I had already given up all hope of annihilating myself, and one evening sat down at a small table in a small room to write my last words. There seemed to be no question that this would be the last room that my body would inhabit, the last time I would sit down to write my last words at that small table. Yet, afterwards, I had no memory of having written anything at all. I had forgotten myself for a time, and when I came back to myself, I saw that instead of writing my last words, as I had intended, I had written only 3 words: The Mechanical Museum. Somewhat astonished, I knew that these words merely referred to a place I had visited as a child, a simple amusement arcade, located along a back street in an obscure resort town that even then was on the verge of degeneration. Since that time, the memory of this resort town attraction had now and again come to my mind, and on several occasions I had even written those words, the Mechanical Museum, for one reason or another. But I had never written them in a state in which I had forgotten or lost myself, if only for a few moments, and I had certainly never written them in a style of handwriting that was clearly not my own but that of another hand, and presumably of another self, possibly one that had finally discovered the secret of annihilation. Thus, when I arrived in the degenerate resort town, I was under the spell of a desperate ecstasy, simply to find that this place still existed, however close it may have come to the point of total degeneration. And when I found the amusement arcade still in operation along a deserted back street of the town, I was filled with faith in my scheme to visit this place as a pilgrimage to a temple or a shrine, entering its open door at night and out of season. Above that door were colored lights that spelled out the words, The Mechanical Museum. From inside, I heard the sound of soft, strange music. Alone in this dim emporium, unwatched by any attendants or patrons or even by the curator of this tawdry institution, I moved from one mechanical exhibit to another, amazed at how much they resembled my memory of them, or rather the dreams I had experienced over the years of this distant memory. For in those long-past days of childhood, I was barely tall enough to reach the thin slots in which I dropped a coin or two that set in motion the mechanisms within a rectangular glass case, which seemed so far beyond my vision. Now, I could look into those cases at eye level, as I had always dreamed of doing. I felt all the faith in the world in the brilliance of my scheme to make this pilgrimage to the Mechanical Museum, and to proceed from one machine to another, following what I believed was a formula for deliverance that would conclude in my annihilation. Like the rest of the world, I could not resist the idea that my search was almost at an end. No one can resist such an idea, least of all when it is put into our minds in the hours of the night and during a time that is out of season. The Gravedigger. For a few moments, I was allowed to be at ease in the land of the dead. For a few coins, I could activate one of the machines at the Mechanical Museum and cause a cemetery to glow into pale visibility, as if illuminated by the cut-out circle of moon dangling from a thin wire in the dark distance of the phony horizon. On the other side of the machine's glass, all the sights of the toy necropolis came to life, and I gazed my way into the gravedigger's habitat. He was positioned at the front edge of his crude and wonderful world, his back turned to my invading eyes. There was a tiny shovel in his tiny hands, and his stiff, mechanical arms moved back and forth, pitching invisible earth into the open grave at his feet, a grave that was forever in progress. Nestled in this shallow pit was a miniature coffin, a humble box without adornments. The headstone above the grave was a small ivory-colored square fixed to the gritty ground, as were all the others, but no inscriptions could be read upon them in the pasteboard moonlight. Crooked shadows were cast by frail, leafless trees and by the thin posts of the gates, which traced a twisting perimeter about the cemetery landscape. And for a few moments I was allowed to be at ease in the land of the dead, watching the gravedigger in a trance as his mechanical arms pumped back and forth, his shovel throwing not earth but empty air upon that coffin, whose grave was not as deep as a grave should be. Yet I lost myself in the gravedigger's good work, and felt the soft weight of dirt in my shovel's blade. I was at home beneath my moon, and mindlessly at peace among a world of coffined bodies, settled into the ground where I had put them forever. And forever I would be filling this final grave, eternally at burial in an eternal night, silently staring earthward in the stillness and shadows, my arms in perfect motion, my shovel swinging back and forth to bury the dead, this being the only action, the only stirring, within an infinite darkness. Then the gravedigger froze in his movements, his pitching shovel came to a stop. For a few moments I had been allowed to be at ease in the land of the dead, but at the end the gravedigger's head haltingly swiveled about, and the mad expression carved upon his wooden face cast me forever out of his mechanical paradise. A deep sense of loss had now been instilled within me, yet for a few seconds I had also experienced the absolute loss of myself. Perhaps this departure of self should be viewed as a form of temporal annihilation. 2 minutes of my existence had been expertly buried by a vacated form of consciousness in the guise of the gravedigger, but once he had abruptly ceased his good work, my spiritual self had been quick to rise from the dead. By the very act of digging, I had become a contented combination of both gravedigger and corpse. Yet, for all my unflagging work to cover and conceal, always had the grave been far too shallow to prevent my instant resurrection. All I could do now was mourn my loss. The Sleeper. I became as though a moth to a constant and unnecessary light. A small town was brightly lit by the descending beam from an overhead spotlight. This corner of the Mechanical Museum appeared at odds with the distant memory of my childhood visitation, and yet there was some aspect about this particular machine's melancholy streets that seemed vaguely familiar. I had my suspicions, but to throw more light upon these I would need to be gifted darkness. Just a few coins, and the overhead beam dimmed to nothingness. Beneath the glass case lighted a sequence of occasional street lamps, their yellow glow hardly penetrating the fresh darkness of that small, degenerate town. A mechanical moon began to rise, slowly upwards by way of a steel spindle, the tiny bulbs within its glass crescent casting grotesque shadows via the manufactured branches of dark, leafless trees. These fell almost claw-like upon the walls of many dream-haunted houses. My intruding eyes gazed through the lace curtains of one upstairs window, and the comforting glow of a nightlight spread over a small single bed. Resting upon a pillow, I saw the wooden countenance of an eternally sleeping child, who, while tiny squares of cloth blanket rose and fell with the rhythmic timings of sweet oblivion. Strings of sentiment tugged at my soul, and like some emotional marionette, I warmed until I became molded into his mind of innocent dreams. Identity became lost to me in one instant, and so I entered within the eternal dreams of the sleeper. In ethereal form, I wandered the dark streets of that town, reveling in the essence of past and future dream, and delighting in the lonesomeness and seclusion that now enveloped the sleeper. The unreal world of another had become home to me, and being now able to recognize this fact, I knew with certainty that a true annihilation of my former self would soon become complete. Very swiftly, all sign of memory faded to become replaced by the ongoing construction of infinite possibility. I felt the coldness of the eternal night, then looked upwards to see the crescent moon moving slowly through the blackened skies. Contentment reigned in me, so that I became invisibly escorted through these desolate streets of my new home, but always walking to the tune of my own undreamt dream. Though, when the music of this dream began to seem vaguely familiar to me, I became quick to encounter the fleeting presence of unaccountable unease. Over the unworn cobbles of narrow alleys and back streets I roamed, elated at the escape I had made from my forgotten confines. Yet, eventually I was certain I heard a soulless screaming coming from beyond the door of some long-forgotten attraction. Entering through that door beneath the sign of colored lights, I became temporarily blinded by a sudden beam of bright white light. When my eyes saw again, the crescent moon had descended from the blackened skies above that small town within the glass case, and the return of the spotlight made it no longer possible to peer through those lace curtains into the bedroom of the sleeper. All around me still played the soft, strange music of his formerly undreamt dream, but I had now filled with much hatred and envy at the thought of that eternally sleeping child, and how he had betrayed me. I knew that anger was a useless and detrimental emotion to my search for true and lasting annihilation, for this one case of betrayal would ultimately mold with others to provide the secret of the loss I had craved for so long. A voice of silence seemed to speak through the dimness of the emporium, its unspoken words heard only within my head, and I knew that I should now aspire to become one with the spirit of the machines. For some seconds I shut my eyes, gradually emptying my mind of the fresh venom it had generated by way of a primitive longing and despair. Just before I opened them again, I imagined I heard a summons in the form of a softly chiming bell. The Transparent Church. A velvety darkness hung about the glass case of this machine, while a false sense of peace and belonging issued upwards before I had even paid for its services. By inserting just a few coins within its sacred slot, I was to be afforded the sight of a glass-roofed church. The sound of an unknown hymn struck up from some tiny, secreted speaker, and as my intruding eyes looked down through the glass case of the machine and through the glass roof of the transparent church, I saw a congregation of mechanical figures simultaneously depart their pews, rising to sing in worship of the one who had granted their unknown lives with this mechanical paradise. Like me, each one had been summoned towards their own annihilation by the spirit chimes of the non-existent church bell, yet these pure tones were, of course, heard only within the confines of their delicately tuned minds. In the shadowy area of the chancel, I saw the church organist. His hands rose and fell in precise alternation, picking out notes with all the great dexterity granted him by his eternal automation. Yet, like the music and words of every unknown hymn I had ever heard, the quality came as nothing but the most depressing dirge to my ears, and I wondered about the kind of God able to derive pleasure from such an audible force of blackness. This time, I knew only the deepest discontentment, and so that I concentrated with all my mind upon the automated hands of the church organist. As clearly as I could see through the glass roof of the transparent church, could I also see the plan of deliberate expulsion being put into practice by the organist and that untrustworthy wooden congregation. With all my will, I fought against this very novel and cruel method of excommunication, so that eventually I became seated before that mock musical instrument, filling the air with my twisted notes, and becoming one with the hostile brain of the organist. But in my naivety, I discovered I had played myself right into the mechanical hands of the organist. Thus, I had found out that my discontentment held the peculiar properties needed to indirectly bless me with a most unholy form of annihilation and begrudged worship, for in my mind I had renounced the undoubtedly soulless God that dwelt in the heavens above this mechanical haven, and in so doing I had denied my own existence and self. For who, if not me, had so recently held the position of godlike power needed to bring life to this mechanical congregation of singing sinners? Didn't those wooden forms of chameleon allegiance live only to worship, and so worship only to live? The hymn now came to its close, the movement of my wooden hands halting most abruptly above the mock ivory keys of the organ. With a decisive click, the interior of the transparent church fell once more to darkness. Yet, for a while my eyes remained sightless, peering into the eternal dark of some unknown universe, and all this time my dislocated mind pondered the lesson of the silent sermon I had unconsciously been afforded. My awareness now rose me upward to new levels via the knowledge I had successfully claimed ownership of, this lifting me high above the rank of the singing sinners. Yet, to my utter dismay, it also exchanged my status of loss for the reunification of self. Had the spirit of this miniature shrine, which I had deliberately visited at night and at a time out of season, contrived in such a way that I should again lose my loss? Once more, I stood alone in the dimness of the emporium. The fact that no other patron had so far made entrance into the mechanical museum was a thing which both puzzled and pleased me greatly, and yet always I knew the constant feeling that some unseen form of intelligence observed my choice of machine, perhaps intrigued by my belief that such a means could ever result in a formula that would conclude in deliverance. Walking some little way onwards, my attention became stolen by what at first appeared to be an upright miniature coffin. I peered closely through the glass case of this exhibit, quickly finding just how mistaken I was. The punchinello. Dipping my hand into my pocket, I took out those few coins I needed to bring the punchinello to life. In the following second came the presence of a light to gift me easy sight of that brightly colored cabinet of dubious entertainment. Upon the sand-covered floor before it sat 4 rows of silently watching wooden children. Yet, when Punchinello began his most violent routine, every cross-legged figure became quick to give up all pretense of innocence, clapping their tiny wooden hands together in a shocking display of macabre delight. My intruding eyes then fixed upon the sinister figure of Punchinello itself, and my ears filled with the corrupt laughter of children at every swipe of the wooden club held in its hand. The uniformed authority figure it struck out at gave vent to timely cries of inhuman pain, all being perfectly synchronized with the cruel contact of the wooden club. Yet I was to lose myself in the violence of Punchinello's repeated action, so that I saw myself as a conductor of mechanized puppets, with the wooden club within my wooden hand being akin to a conductor's baton. For with every swipe I made, there was a crescendo to their malign laughter, and in my head I knew they eternally mocked at all humanity by their response to this bizarre parody of our behavior. But still, I became one with the puppet soul of the Punchinello, reveling in its deathless quality and eternal cruelty, and sneering at the brief and pointless life of humanity. Then, all I knew was the violent motion of that wooden club, so that for a few moments I became enveloped of my own swift approaching deliverance. Yet, Very abruptly, the punchinello froze in its movements, the cruel club poised forever to wound the representation of all mankind, the puppet holding extreme dominance over its own maker. Its carved head now peering upwards and into my own face, its expression was one of the sneering triumph and elation, secure in the knowledge it had cast me eternally outwards of its own mechanical paradise. With my expulsion, I knew only desperation and a sense that the time left to complete my deliverance was swiftly running out. My thoughts ticked away to the themes of hollowness and futility, to the grimness of life and the joke that is living. Yet still I sought to find the one avenue of escape, the hidden formula that would still bring me self-annihilation before it was too late. And now I realized that the degenerate state of this resort town was in tune with the degenerate state of my own existence, so that since the initial visitation made in my youth, the shrine of Mechanical Museum had remained a sacred place, invisibly linked to me via memory and soul. Thus, it had gradually extended outwards during the passing of time, and the natural weakening of my physical body had allowed its slow entrance even to that quarter. The Mechanical Museum had now totally pervaded my being, and I had become one with the shrine of my youth, in all senses, psychological, physical, spiritual. I had now returned to the Mechanical Museum, so that the owning of these departments meant my deliverance was actually down to the godlike power and mercy of the shrine itself. I prayed only that my continual worship at this shrine through the passing years, though made from a great distance, would prove to be enough for the granting of my own annihilation. Only time would tell. The Clock Tower. In time, I began to hear the sound of ticking. I walked through the dimness of the emporium until I stood before the glass case wherein originated this sound. Inside the glass, I could see a glinting object which appeared to be some type of tower. Again, the general outline reminded me very strongly of a coffin. Hoping with all my heart, I pondered if this machine would bring me the deliverance I had craved for so long, if it could afford me the eternal loss by some sensitive mechanism of its internal carriage. I made no delay in finding out. For just a few coins, I enveloped myself in the folds of time itself. The sudden light of an artificial moon afforded me the sight of the clock tower, but I became shocked to find the tower had been constructed in such a very gruesome manner, and from a building material of such a grim type. For all that bizarre structure was made from an intricate network of tiny, fragmented, yellow-brown bones. Yet it was the actual face of the clock which was the most intriguing part of all that strange mechanism, for I saw the indicating fingers upon it were the detached fingers of a corpse. The pointed nails of both of these fingers detailed the actual time with precision, giving out the message that just 5 more minutes would bring the arrival of midnight. Beneath the face of this clock was a balcony of bone and a large silver chime bell, and I also noticed that many areas were decorated with tiny wreaths of autumn leaves and miniature parodies of dying roses. Peering to the very back of the balcony, I carefully counted 11 tiny wreaths which had been nailed upon the black wood of a most foreboding, coffin-shaped door. And so I tried to lose myself in the vision of that clock tower, but time moved so invisibly that I could not hope to locate its momentum. So once more I resigned myself to death, with my only certainty now being that annihilation could never be regained by a mechanism unable to provoke even the merest sign of loss. Yet, with only 1 more minute to midnight remaining, the slow opening of the coffin-shaped door upon the balcony was to promote a fresh sense of hope and interest in me, for through that door walked a mechanized representation of a figure dressed in black, and very soon I saw the cruelly smiling countenance of death itself. This wooden figure was cloaked in the black shadows of its own eternity, and yet I certainly wanted no part of that false and sinister state. The time remaining to complete my deliverance was now growing very short, for held within this cruel figure's hand was a scythe in the guise of a hammer. Then, very suddenly and inexplicably, I was to find myself stood within a street. It was night, and I was standing in the street of a resort town, out of season. To my ears came the sudden, startling chime of a clock tower which stood high above me, yet I instantly realized this chime was the scream of a tortured human voice. When I heard the second and third screams chime, I knew I listened to the captive souls of those having once visited the shrine of the Emporium before me. With each further scream that chimed into my ears came the further degeneration of my own physical body, and the degeneration of the resort town about me. When the 10th chime came, I instantly collapsed to the rain-damp ground of the street beneath the clock tower, and with the 11th I became crippled with such pain that I could no longer move. Yet the 12th chime never came. After a while, the pain, I knew, began to filter slowly outwards from my body. Then, from my position lain upon my back within the street, I gazed up towards the balcony of the clock tower above me. The moonlight now filtered down to afford a most perfect view, but still there was no figure of malign intent staring down in hatred of me. I almost doubted there ever had been. And then, a sense of realization, of intense elation, suddenly dawned on me. I had now successfully undergone my deliverance into this mechanical paradise. The 12th chime would not now arrive, and for all eternity I would remain lost in this world of this unknown universe, forever wandering the wonderful streets of the Mechanical Museum. The coldness of the mechanical moon. I decided I would lose myself for a while by gazing at the moon. So, I walked along the rain-damp street, gazing upwards into the cold glow of that mechanical orb, which had now become so very real and beautiful to me. Now that time had finally stood still for me, I sent my silent messages back into the past and to my own question self. I spoke silent words of hope into my own questing head, and gave written clues in a style of writing that would indicate my altered existence, the deliverance I had now found. And I loved the coldness of the mechanical moon, looking upon her almost as one may look upon a beautiful, cold, but elegant woman. She was out of reach and only there to be admired, but gradually my love became so deep for her, so deep I would have willingly died for her. Yet, a very fateful thing was my continued obsession with the moon, since who would imagine it could ever be so cold as to betray me? For once, as I reveled in the joy of a walk through all eternity, the glow of its light suddenly went out. And through the deathly darkness of the street I stood in, echoing with the eagerness of an evil, fresh unbound, there suddenly came to my appalled ears the sound of the 12th chime. Then, through all the dreams and thoughts I had ever had, through all the years that were past or still to come, through every beat of this scorned lover's heart, my pain-filled body and soul would do nothing but scream the eternal scream of a tortured death, unending.